Welcome back to TIME100 Talks. I'm here with Robert F. Smith. Robert created one of the world's largest private equity funds, biggest enterprise software enterprises, and famously shocked and delighted the 2019 graduates of Morehouse College last year with a $34 million gift that paid off all of their student debt as well as the debts their parents and guardians had incurred. And we're going to talk about education today and a new initiative I know you're launching and other topics in the news. But I wanted to start kind of broadly. Support for education is a common theme in a great deal of your philanthropy. So many urgent causes in the world. What is it that draws you to education as a focus and to student debt specifically?
Sure. And Edward, thank you for inviting me to share some time with you today and to you and your audience to hear some of the things that we're focused on. I mean, you know, as a son of school teachers and I guess third generation, my mother and father, third generation teachers, education was stressed as probably the most important element in terms of upward mobility and frankly, the ability to deliver back values to your community through educational platforms and pursuits. And, you know, as I matriculated through my career, realizing not only the joy of figuring things out, but also the economic mobility it provided for the African-American community. And the thing that I was always struck by was, you know, those who are really focused on building out educational platforms, the impact that they have, not just on individual lives, but on entire communities. And so the key in my mind is to think about ways to do it at scale, do it in ways that is meaningful. And for different people in different stations in life, some cases it's education so that they can create an opportunity and a vocation. In some it's a professional degree. And in some cases, it is actually to be able to provide a service in the form of, medical service, for instance, to their community. So education is a critical part of, I'll call it the uplifting in our community of America.
And student debt, you know, specifically, what draws you to that?
Well, I'll tell you, Edward, you know, we all, a number of us graduated with massive amounts of student debt. And there were periods of time where call it the student debt ratio to earnings ratio was in a lot more balance of where it is today. There's a startling statistic that my team developed or came across and really started to plow into after I made the Morehouse gift, and it was 70% of the wealth in African-American communities goes towards servicing student debt. And when you think about that in the context of African-Americans have 1/10 of the wealth of white families in America, that is a significant disadvantage. I think the average African-American family has about $17,000 of wealth, and the average white family in America is $171,000+. And if you think about these students graduating and then plowing so much of their wealth opportunity into supporting the student debt, that's a travesty in and of itself. I had the great fortune of being able to liberate really 400 families from that burden last year at Morehouse College. But when I came out of that and really understood the magnitude of the problem, the real challenge was now how do we do this at scale, and how do we do it for communities that I think have a greater opportunity to provide back into their own community. And that's what really we're focused on in terms of the Student Freedom Initiative.
Well, I want to talk about that in a moment, but I'm interested. What have you heard from some of the 2019 Morehouse grads?
There are a number. There's initiatives from many of them saying they're going to look and are paying it, forward for, the class of 2020, 21. And, there are those who are now saying, I can now go teach in my community in STEM, whereas before I was going to have to figure out a way to really pay the student debt back. And I think the beautiful thing is they took what I'll call the challenge to heart. And that challenge is really to be their best selves and to deliver back to their community in ways that their education has prepared them for, and frankly, their community is relying on them for. And, I don't like to single out in the individual because, again,
Sure.
I think it's important that we do these things at scale and en masse, because that's how you lift up entire communities, is not just have it an exception-based story or economy. Of course, we all like the great one story, but I want thousands of these stories, and I want, thousands of Robert Smiths out there who are actually looking to do some things in fields that are exciting to them, and are giving back in the right
Well,
way.
you've set up the perfect transition to the Student Freedom Initiative, which I know is so interesting because it's not only seeking to do this at scale, but it's really as I understand it, a full rethink on traditional loans to finance college education. It's a different approach. Can you describe it and
Sure.
how it's going to work?
If you think about, the whole challenge is, that a lot of the students of color, African Americans in this case in particular, have a disproportionate amount of debt. They typically end up with more, about $7,500 more when they graduate. They typically take jobs that pay less, about $77,000 less than other students. And that's where a lot of their earnings goes towards, servicing this debt as they graduate college. So the SFI initiative is based on a very simple principle, and it really says, okay, how do you now create a sustainable pay it forward model? Well, what's that mean? That means you can take a certain amount of capital and provide loans to juniors and seniors who are studying STEM, because what I'm really focused on is how do we ensure that they are moving into careers of the future as opposed to, quote unquote, a career of the past that gives them earning potential. So that's kind of point one. Point two, you have to ensure that it has a interest rates which are below, parent plus level. So it is manageable. So it's below that. And then point three, to give them the freedom component, if you go and you decide to go work at, Microsoft or Vista or one of these companies and you're earning, lots of money, then you're actually paying back at a faster rate, but still below that interest rate, that pays back into this fund. And if you decide, all right, I now want to go become a teacher and teach math in my local elementary school, then you actually don't pay it back at all. Our pilot is going to be 11 HBCUs. We will graduate 5,000, 4,800 students per year in perpetuity. And as we raise capital, and I think that the total amount is about 1.7 billion. We can lever about half of that, so call it, 900 million or so in equity capital, the other in debt capital. We can graduate all STEM students from HBCUs in essence forever under this program, and it's become self-sustaining. They support the next generation of students, and it gives them flexibility to actually drive back some of what I call their, intellectual property from what they have learned in college and in business back into the communities in ways that matter.
And when does it launch? How does someone apply to be supported by this fund?
Sure. So we're planning on launching fall, the class, call it juniors and seniors, fall of 2021. We've already received from the Fund 2 Foundation the first $50 million grant. We just got our 501c3 designation. We are partnering with a number, again, 11 HBCUs. These are 11 HBCUs that graduate the highest number of STEM students. And we'll be rolling this out over the next coming quarters as we raise the next, call it 400 plus million. And then we'll have another 400 million of investor capital, and then lever the rest to look to work with all 90 plus HBCUs for STEM graduates going forward. But fall of 2021 is the initial rollout.
And do you see it eventually extending beyond STEM?
It can. As you know, I'm a technologist at heart. I think about, the sustainable careers of the future. And I think it has to be somewhat, they will all be technically enabled, irrespective of what you do. If you're, from, truck transportation driver to, physicist, there's just going to be a massive demand for these STEM careers. And I think that gives this group of students the greatest opportunity to launch themselves into, the next generation of business, commercial, and employment opportunities. So that's why we focus on STEM. Now, of course, if we're lucky and TIME does what it does and helps us raise twice that amount, then we'll be able to extend the STEM categories.
I want to pull you way back for a moment. Just reading about your life and thinking about this moment when the world is focused in such a powerful way on injustice against Black Americans and racism and systemic racism, to two events in your early life. I understand your mother took you as an infant to the March on Washington, and that you also experienced a murder in your own family that I know had powerful impact on you. How have those early experiences shaped who you've become, what you're doing in this moment?
Every African American that I know has experienced racism not once, but many times in their lives. And if you're of my generation, you found it was thrust upon you at a very young age when we went to desegregated schools. And you would hear comments from classmates that were shocking and surprising, for young people to hear. And in some cases, your parents would chalk it up to ignorance of their family. But over time, you knew there's just, deep and rampant racism that ran through a lot of communities. And you would see some of your friends leave the school and, they're going out to a different school for different reasons. But you knew they were going out because they didn't want to be in school with brown children. And that's a horrible reality of America. And as well as to see, and I talked about this, one of my uncles who had just graduated, had his master's degree, just recently married, and got a job with the state. And his job was to go and tour facilities and do inspections, etc. And he had a state car and a state credit card for fuel. And he was at a fuel station in one town, and the attendant decided that African American shouldn't have a state credit card, so it must be stolen. So he shot him and killed him. And when you deal with those sort of realities when you're young, 7, 8, 9 years old, it will shape you in a couple different ways. And to me, my parents were focused on, well, Robert, you need to, continue to work as hard as you can, become your best self, go strive, and don't let anyone stop you from looking to achieve and accomplish your goals. And not as many young African Americans necessarily have that in their household. And so part of what shapes me is to provide and look to provide optimism and pathways. And frankly, what I focus on is on-ramps. How do I create on-ramps into education, on-ramps into job training, internships, on-ramps, and uplifts inside of corporations and companies, and connectivity that uplifts the spirit and frankly enables students and professionals and adults to be productive. And that's really what I focus on. So you start thinking about, you and I were chatting about this before. What I like about this series is it's solution oriented, because too often we sit here and hear people talk about the problem and the problems as opposed to saying, here are the solutions. And I'm focused on how do we drive solutions in corporate America? How do we drive capital from corporate America into the deserts that are these African American, Latinx, and in rural communities? And a lot of those deserts, there's food deserts, banking deserts, broadband deserts, healthcare deserts, all of which I think can be solved by intelligent corporate executives determining that this is a problem they're going to solve. We're going to take some percentage of our income, capacity, intellectual property, technology, and solve these problems for communities of Americans to enable them to participate fully in the economy here. And a very strong economy with everyone participating in it is what gives people hope, optimism, and frankly feeling like that they are entitled to what is the bounty of this country.
This is the 2% solution program that you're working
Correct.
on. Can you give us if you
Sure.
will.
There are really 8 or so industries that if you solve some of the problems in those industries, it changes dramatically the economic outcome for 20+% of Americans. And just to give you an example, I use the example of banking deserts. 70% of African American communities don't have a branch bank in the community. And so as a result of that, this was exposed during the PPP distribution problem, and I had the good fortune of working with a number of people from Senator Chuck Schumer to Secretary Mnuchin and Ivanka Trump to say we've got to go solve this problem of enabling these small what I call capillary banking systems, which are community development financial institutions, CDFIs, MDIs, which are minority depository institutions, enable them to deliver these PPP loans to these small businesses. 90% of African American companies are sole proprietors. They have 4 or fewer employees. They weren't gaining access to the PPP program. So technically enabling that infrastructure of capillary banks was one of the jobs that one of my teams of one of our companies took on and did a spectacular job. And then delivering that capital, these small loans, $25,000 loans to help these companies stay in business was an essential part of the work that we did. So from that, it was highlighted that very few of these banks very few of these small businesses actually had banking relationships. And I said, well, what we need to do is enable them by making a more robust technical infrastructure and driving capital. And if you look at it, I said the top 10 banks, for instance, have made $970 billion over the last 10 years. I said, well, if you took 2% of that, call it $20 billion, and delivered that to them over the next 10 years, you could actually make a very robust infrastructure for delivering capital into these small community companies, these small businesses. And those businesses could regenerate that capital and actually start to rejuvenate and repair those communities.
Our most recent cover of Time was we called The Overdue Awakening. Do you think these efforts, calls to action, do you see them lasting this time, or do you worry that America will go back to sleep?
We all worry America will go back to sleep, but when you have this number of Americans who are not working and will take a while to get reabsorbed into the economy, and if we don't focus on getting the young people engaged with optimistic views on what capitalism provide, I think we could be at a different form of a turning point. I think we have got to solve the equitable justice and the economic justice and the education justice and healthcare justice challenges that have plagued this country for decades and for generations. And frankly, what we're witnessing and seeing today are, decades and generations of economic and social injustice. I think our role is to provide the pathways to solve the problems. It is every corporate executive's role to now engage in those solution-oriented opportunities at mass and scale, and not, with what I call perfunctory, and frankly, donations that are a mere drop in the bucket. It's important to realize this is we've got systemic issues that are caused by systemic racism that need to be deconstructed, and frankly, a reconstruction of what are the true values of what America is to stand for. I have to remain optimistic because what choice do I have? And it is incumbent upon me to do my part to educate, awaken, and enable all those who want to participate, the willing participants, pathways that they can actually make a change that they will be proud of, and that their children will be proud that they did in their lifetime in this moment of inflection.
Well, that is, I think, a great place to end, a note of optimism, but also call to action and focus on solutions. And thank you for being with us and for everything you're doing.
Thank you for ensuring that we're focused on the solutions aspect of this. And I look forward to you and I spending some time talking about how many great changes have happened as a result of the time that we are all focused on these issues together.